2024 was not a good year for DEI, and 2025 promises not to be much better. Welcome, I'm Jim Falk. Companies and educational institutions who once embraced diversity, equity, and inclusion are now either openly withdrawing their support or silently tiptoeing away. So we ask, is DEI dead, on life support, or in an induced coma? So let's bring in our guest. Eric Smith is a research fellow at the Cato Institute and president of Free Black Thought. That's an organization that celebrates viewpoint diversity among Black Americans. He has a doctorate in rhetorical theory from the University of Illinois at Chicago. His primary areas of research are civil discourse and the rhetoric of DEI in the United States. Meagan is the director of Independent Women's Forum's Center for American Safety and Security. She's a graduate of West Point, holds a master's in forensic psychology from George Washington University, and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia. As a former paratrooper and combat veteran, she continues to advocate for service members through a number of board memberships and volunteer activities. And I should mention, she's on the Board of Regents of VMI, the Virginia Military Institute. Welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for being here. So one of the things that I've learned in preparing to have the privilege of talking with you is that there's a lot of confusion about just the definitions of DEI. And I think the word that causes the most angst and is a flashpoint is equity. Eric, let me go to you first and just ask you to sort of put this in context for our viewers.
Well, equity in the context of contemporary DEI means equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity, which is to say that you're not making sure that people have the same starting line. You're making sure that they cross the finish line at the same time, right? Regardless of what they did between the starting line and the finish line. What's more, equity seems to result in a relinquishing of rigor when it comes to certain things, like aptitude tests, grades even, right? All these things that we've been using for quite some time to measure merit and success are being taken away because they're seen as, well, not equitable. So that's the issue going on right now. The definition that is popular in DEI is not the definition that we have as a society.
Now, are there issues about the definitions, before we move on, about diversity and inclusion? Because I've also seen now more companies are using the word belonging. Eric?
Yes. Well, diversity is just diversity of bodies, right? To acquire something called racial balancing. They want their company or their school to reflect the surrounding area or the country at large, right? But there's no diversity of viewpoint. You know, there's one viewpoint you can have, and if you don't have that, well, you're in trouble. Regarding inclusion, inclusion has manifested as kind of a censoring, right? Inclusion means you don't commit what are called microaggressions, which are small, inadvertent insults, right? That could be anything. So suddenly you're not talking to people because you don't want to take a chance of insulting them and getting in trouble.
That's
right?
political correctness, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So inclusion actually silences people.
So, Meagan, let's talk about the military, because as soon as the Trump administration came in, there was major changes with DEI. And yet the standards, from my understanding, for men and women were pretty much the same. The issue was, as Eric said, on the word outcome. Is that a fair statement?
So actually, Jim, I would push back a little bit here and say that there are some different standards across men and women. And that's inherently a challenging thing, because when there are different standards between men and women, there is oftentimes the assumption or a belief that then the women do not meet the same standards as the men. And oftentimes that comes from a physical perspective because the physical standards are different. There has been a massive push over the last year or so, and I expect to see this in the current administration, by which the standards are the same based upon your job or your military occupational specialty, meaning that men and women will have the opportunity to participate in whatever military occupational specialty, but the standards will be the same. And that goes back to that merit-based piece, that you should have the opportunity to start on the finish line, but how you cross matters. And whoever is fastest and or best should be the one that crosses, and we should not prejudice that based upon gender or sex.
Give me an example where the standards were different, if they've changed.
So the military physical fitness test. So there is a different standard for men and women. There was when we transitioned from I'll use the Army here as an example, the Army physical fitness test to the Army combat test. The expectation was there was going to be a standard based on job, military occupational specialty, not based on biological sex. And there was a kind of a long period of time by which this accession of this kind of new test was done. People were trained, new equipment was bought, there was all this research. And then we found out that, surprise, men and women are biologically different. It was much more challenging for women to meet this standard that they said that they had to meet. And so instead of saying that we are going to keep the standard the same, which we absolutely should, they lowered the standard for women. And what ended up happening is that erodes trust, faith, and confidence that the person next to you is capable of meeting the same standard because the standard is not the same.
Eric, I'm holding in my hand an article that you wrote in November of this past year. I'm a Black PhD, and here's why I left academia. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that? Why'd you leave?
Well, about 5, maybe 6 years ago now, I was on a listserv that was pretty much the premier listserv in my field of rhetoric and composition. And a debate came up, and I had the gall to say that maybe it's not racist to teach standard English to Black students. That got a reaction that changed me. I was called a white supremacist by white people, right? I was, insulted. Rumors were spread about me. There was this campaign to silence me. I got the last laugh, obviously. I did not stay silent. In fact, I spoke so loudly that I'm sitting here in front of you right now. But that really changed my perception of what was going on. I knew there were illiberal people in academia, people who did not believe in free speech and equality in the way that we think about it today. But I didn't think they had that much power. I went from laughing to them to taking them seriously in about one weekend. But that's what happened, and that never improved. So 4 years later, I decided, you know what, I got to get out of here. I can do more outside of academia to change academia than I can inside. Behind enemy lines is a tough place to be.
Are you seeing more of your colleagues, African American, who are taking the same view as you and perhaps trying to change or unable to and leaving?
I know a lot of African American professors who feel the same way I do. They're not leaving necessarily. Well, I don't blame them for not leaving, especially if they have tenure or something like that. I gave up tenure because my mission changed. My mission went from, writing books that only 6 people would read and being happy with it, right, to challenging this illiberalism in academia and society at large. And for that, I needed to be outside of academia.
Meagan, in a sense, the same thing has happened with the military. I've seen statistics about how the military is having issues with recruitment. Part of it is because a great number of Americans are not physically fit, but also because they don't feel that they can get a fair shake in the military. Is that changing?
I do think it's changing. First, I want to commend Eric just because I come a little bit from academia. The courage it takes to walk away from tenure is incredible in order to serve a bigger mission. And so I'm extraordinarily impressed by that. And to your point, to your question, Jim, I think recruitment and retention has a whole host of issues. It's kind of heterogeneous about why we're having so many challenges. But at the core of it is actually this movement away from what I would call lethality or readiness. The military became to look like this kind of broader social program type behemoth versus doing what it is supposed to do, which is to fight and win our nation's wars. That's it. Granted, there are some things within the DoD that purport to, to be about humanitarian assistance, but ultimately the DoD is hard power. And that means there has to be rigorous standards that everyone is held to. And then if you fail, you are held accountable. I think part of the major issue in particular with DEI is that it erodes accountability. People aren't held accountable when they fail for a variety of reasons. And then oftentimes that is used as a kind of a gloss over these failures as a way of protecting people or protecting institutions. And that was happening in the DoD.
I think one thing that you're also seeing when DEI was really at the forefront was just the enormous amount of money that was spent on it and the administrative cost. Eric, I'm sure you experienced that.
Yes, I have. I've seen it again from the outside looking in, as well as from the inside. I used to actually be a diversity officer in the mid-aughts. I wasn't doing it the way they're doing it now, but even then, it seemed like a kind of waste of time and energy and money, right? Things weren't working. I was preaching to the choir a lot. Unfortunately, DEI is a billion-dollar industry. It's going to be hard for people to walk away from that. And it's also going to be hard for people to admit that racism isn't a problem if your job is to get rid of racism, right? An exterminator wants the bugs to infest your house. He needs to make his money. Well, a diversity officer or people who work in the DEI industry, in a sense, need racism in order to justify their roles.
And when you talk about the dollars, let me just throw out a few statistics. At the Pentagon, $68 million was spent on DEI in fiscal year 22, $114 million in FY24. And here's the one that I found really staggering. The University of Michigan spent over $250 million on DEI programs. And it's estimated that, let me see, where did I see that? $8 billion spent annually by companies for DEI. So that gets me now to, Robbie Starbuck, and the whole push to get companies to withdraw from DEI. Tell us, I'm not sure, Eric, can you tell us a little bit more about Starbuck and his campaigns?
Well, I wasn't aware of Starbuck until a couple of weeks ago, to be honest with you. And I saw him pushing back on DEI and corporations. I'm not 100% on board with the way he did it sometimes, but I am on board with the result he was trying to get, which is getting DEI as it is currently manifesting out of corporations. We got to get it out of higher education now. You mentioned Michigan State or Michigan University, getting rid of their DEI.
University of Michigan.
University of Michigan, yes. That money can be spent on better things like outreach programs, right? That make material differences. Have a pipeline between a university and several high schools in downtrodden areas, and give the students an opportunity to get used to the idea of being a college student at this particular campus. A lot of the issue with retention in higher education is culture shock. Students go from a very homogenous place to a very relatively more diverse place, and it's a foreign thing to them. It won't be foreign if you start freshman year in high school with these outreach programs or something like that. That's a much better use of these funds, and it will be a lot cheaper.
So, Eric, you said that perhaps you're not supportive of Starbucks' approach. Why is that? And what is his approach? I gather it's really online, social media, and...
Yes. What I don't like is the apparent lack of empathy. I understand why he wants to get rid of DEI. It's the same reason I want to get rid of DEI. But there are people out there who don't understand why we want to get rid of it. And there are people in it, doing it, who have the best intentions, but are caught in a, less than stellar system, right? So I would just couch my words differently than he does, right? I would, with the same amount of rigor, try to get rid of DEI, but I do it with more empathetic language.
And he's gone after a number of large companies, but one company in particular stands out as saying, we are going to continue to support DEI as strongly as we have, and that's Costco. And I'm just wondering, though, Has the pendulum shifted too fast and too hard away from DEI and perhaps will have unintended consequences?
I can see how it has swung too far to the right, and the fact that anybody with dark skin is being called a DEI hire these days, which is not exactly what we were going for, right? So there's that. But at the same time, I'm very optimistic about where we are right now because we're returning to merit. We're returning to um, test aptitude grades that actually reflect where the students should be in higher ed and why, and things like that. We were not doing that before. We got rid of agency and merit. We instead of looking at the people who got in to college, we're looking at the people who didn't get into college and why they didn't. We're not asking the Black students who got into Harvard, hey, what'd you do? How'd you do that? And emulate that. We're not doing that right now. And we're going to start doing that, I think, because we have to.
How did the George Floyd situation in 2020 really create this momentum for DEI? Eric, I'll go with you to you first, and then I want to hear more about the experience in the military with the George Floyd murder.
Well, we saw it. We saw all 8.5 minutes of it. We saw a man dying and being killed by a police officer, and that aligned with a lot of the ideas out there that police are especially cruel to people of color. Well, you had your quote unquote proof with that video, right? So everybody got on board with that. I mean, that was a very unfortunate moment, but also a very rich moment in that we could have done this better. Now that everybody was listening, we could have done DEI in a way that's more aligned with the civil rights movement of the 60s and early 70s. Instead, we went for this all white people are bad, all Black people are victims thing, and here we are now.
What about in the military? And Meagan, I'd like you to draw on your experience as a alumna of West Point, and then also now at VMI, where you're on the board.
So I was not on active duty when this occurred. I think that the important thing that I would say that kind of shed a light on everything was that there was already a bit of this, and I'm going to call it a rot in the sense of the definitions that Eric used around DEI, but it was existing within the military. The infrastructure was there, and then it was able to be exploited by people who didn't understand why it should be used or how it should be used. And so they took this opportunity, which could have been, to Eric's point, a great teaching moment or an opportunity to really discuss this in what needed to be a nuanced way and address certainly pockets all over the place that needed to be addressed. But instead, what happened was an exploitation of this framework. There was an explosion around what DEI meant. And then, because those kind of tendrils were already existing in bureaucracy in the government or in academia, people were then able to rapidly expand on it, bring in more dollars. And to Eric's point earlier, once you have dollars in, getting dollars out is very challenging, and it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. And so these programs within the DoD got bigger, broader, touched more pieces, and began to be more challenging to pull back. They just expanded. And then that became an even broader issue within, in particular, the DoD, where focus seemed to be pulling away from things like lethality, the ability to fight and kill, readiness, the ability to have materials that allow people to do that job, and unity and cohesion. Because if you're focusing on what makes you different, you're not focusing on what makes you united. And the biggest strength of the military is cohesion. It's not individualism, it's the ability to fight and win together. And if you're focused on the things that make you different, well, you're not together anymore.
Eric, how do we get over this basically a hump that is preventing Americans to really talk about these issues? I mean, this is really in your house.
Yes. I am a rhetorician and I study civil discourse. And what I see missing, well, I see a few things missing. A lot of people who call themselves DEI proponents are against freedom of speech, right? I don't know if you've noticed that. They demonize it as a tool of the oppressor, not realizing that the oppressed are the ones who need it the most, right? The oppressor, the powerful are going to speak no matter what, because they're powerful. Free speech is for the quote unquote little guy. I think a lot of people who are against free speech, however, are just not good at it. right? When somebody says something they don't like, they don't have the ability, the rhetorical skills to say something back in an effective way. So they just want to get rid of free speech, right? That's not the way to do this. I think we need a resurgence of rhetoric as a tried and true skill in education, not just in college, not even just in secondary education. Before that, even, I think if we give people these tools, they have the confidence to go into an argument or a debate because, hey, I can possibly win this, as opposed to, I don't know the big words he's using and I don't know these tactics, so I'm just going to back away and tell him to shut up.
So are you
Right?
advocating that we put this in our curriculum in what level? Middle school, high school? And
Middle school. Yes. Yes, middle school. There are schools who are giving scholarships for the debate team, like it's the football team. We need more of that, right? We need more emphasis on the debate team in high school. We should start debate teams in middle school. We should at least study rhetoric and the surface level stuff of rhetoric at a young age. I think by then we will have informed adults who know how to persuade and argue their points.
So one of the things is who are very supportive of DEI will say that companies who follow it, really stick to it, they're more profitable. And McKinsey has done a number of studies on this. Do you agree with that?
I agree that diversity of viewpoint is very powerful. And yeah, sure, people with certain skin colors may have different experiences than people with other skin colors, and they can put those experiences together and things like that. That does not justify the methodology of DEI that we've seen the past few years. What it does justify is diversity of viewpoint, which has been demonized by DEI in the past few years.
Do you really see that, Meagan, in the military for a while? Were they afraid to speak out?
Absolutely. And I'm aggressively agreeing over here with everything Eric is saying, because all of the studies that people reference around how diversity builds stronger teams, if you actually dig into the study, if you take the time to look at it, what they're talking about is diversity of thought. They're not talking about diversity of immutable characteristics. What builds strong teams capable of solving complex problems is the diversity of how you approach it, and then your ability to persuade other team members how to approach this new problem. That's true of the military as well. Of course, there's physical standards that you have to meet. There are certain standards that are required. And in this kind of modern age of warfare, what we need is that cognitive diversity tackling our toughest problems. And that is where we need to be focusing. When we're talking about diversity, it's focusing on the ability to bring those things to bear into the table, not the things that are immutable. Because, I mean, to Eric's point, yes, of course, gender or sex or your race or your ethnicity may by virtue confer different life experiences that could impact your diversity of thought, but that shouldn't be our starting point. Our starting point should be that cognitive diversity that then leads itself to building these stronger teams.
Eric, I want to get back to something that concerns me somewhat. It was an article I read in one of the major papers saying that, okay, DEI now has been thrown out, so we can say anything we want. We don't have to treat people with the same respect. Political correctness, forget it. How do companies really protect themselves and be sure that their employees realize DEI may no longer be there, but a lot of the foundation of it was important?
Well, the Civil Rights Act is still there, right? And what that does is make sure that people aren't discriminated against based on race and that resources aren't hidden from them based on their race. We have that. We have those laws already etched in stone, not in stone, but almost in stone, right? Let's just go with that, right? Let's make sure that we are cognizant that there are people out there who discriminate based on race and keep an eye out on them, right? And what we need to do is when we see something concrete that is definitely racist and not maybe racist, we have to step in and say something. And if it is maybe racist, we have to talk about what happened. That sounds so simple, doesn't it? But for some reason we couldn't do it the last 5 or 6 years.
So, Meagan, a lot of people have been talking about extremism in the military. And I recently had a discussion with former Secretary Mark Esper, and he said that this is exaggerated. But is there a problem? And again, by pulling away from DEI, could that maybe exacerbate it?
So, a couple of things. So, freedom of speech is not freedom of consequence. And that is robustly true in the military. I think what has happened is because there's been a hyper focus on all of these different pieces. Eric mentioned earlier microaggressions, the idea that you say anything that then could be held against you has created then an underground movement of then people saying things hidden from view, which then allows extremism to foment. That is the worst thing that could happen. What we should be promoting is exactly what Eric said earlier, civil discourse, because sometimes people are raised in homes where maybe there wasn't the opportunity to be confronted with challenging ideas that different for them. It doesn't make them a bad person. It's an opportunity to have a discussion or to build bridges or to inform and to educate. And instead, what has happened though is these people may have these ideas that could be bad and or dangerous, but then when they're told to suppress them, don't talk about them, don't mention them, and so then they don't. And then they feel isolated, which can lead to more extremism, or they are never then challenged by having those ideas. What we need is more discussion, more challenging of ideas, more debate around these things, not less. And then if someone does make an egregious violation, is truly racist or prejudice, that's not a freedom of speech violation. I mean, there should be consequences for that. You are free to say it, and then you must accept accountability for having said it.
And you think we're ready for that?
I don't think we're there yet, but I hope we get there soon.
What do you think, Eric?
I think we need to be baptized by fire, as it were. We need to jump into these conversations, and we need to model them. You know, I want to model these ideas, model civil discourse, so that people see what it looks like, right? People realize that it's not the end of the world, right? If somebody disagrees with you, you're comparing ideas and you're making each other better, right?
Well,
we need, yes.
Well, I think one thing we've done today is we have started this conversation, and I hope we can continue it. Thank you both for being with us. And as we've discussed, providing a level playing field for everyone, eliminating intolerance and racism are certainly important goals. But how to get there, that's a question. And as we've discussed, there are valid disagreements on the best means to accomplish some of these objectives. We really hope that today's discussion has helped frame the debate, which undoubtedly will continue over the coming weeks and months. And to all of you, thank you for joining our conversation, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.